Gentlemen, let's talk about the writing process. It's important to think of writing as a process. There are a number of steps to follow, and if you follow them consistently, odds are you'll come up with something pretty good. All right, step number one is to select a topic. That's the easy one. Once you've selected a topic, brainstorm ideas. You're going to brainstorm, first of all, a thesis, which we will call a working thesis, and then you're going to brainstorm as many examples as you can. Don't edit yourself on the number of examples. There are no bad examples at this point. Once you've completed your brainstorming, odds are you're going to need to organize it, and so that's step number 3. Organize your paper, and a very good method for doing that is to create an outline. A good outline will have everything in front of you so that when you sit down to type the paper in the rough draft, which is step number 4, everything will be there. After having a rough draft, and don't edit yourself on the draft, by the way, just let it go. You can edit later in step 5, revision and editing. Revision is about moving things around, adding and deleting things, and editing is about cleaning up those picky little errors. And finally, after you've done this a number of times, come up with a final draft. The first thing to understand about writing papers is that it doesn't come naturally to many people. If you want to be a good writer, you have to work at it. So if you're not Flannery O'Connor or Mark Twain, what do? That's what we're going to discuss in this video. Let's begin by reviewing the 5-paragraph essay. You begin with an introductory paragraph, then you have 3 body paragraphs, and finally you have a conclusion. Pretty simple. Let's look more closely at each of these parts. Let's talk about the introduction. Structure your introduction like an inverted pyramid. Begin with a general statement on your topic, and get more and more specific as the paragraph progresses until you conclude your paragraph with your thesis statement. You must also include the title, the author, and the genre in the first paragraph, the tag. Preferably include the tag the first time you make specific reference to the text. Okay, now let's talk about a body paragraph. The body paragraph begins with a topic sentence in which you state your argument. The argument is more specific than a thesis statement, but more general than an example. The argument can also be called a point, a claim, a sub-argument, any number of things. But basically, it is what you intend to prove in this paragraph only. Follow the topic sentence with the body of your paragraph. The body should contain specific examples from the text. Make sure that you explain those examples. It should also include a quote, including context. Finally, write the conclusion to this paragraph alone. In your conclusion, try to explain how this argument proves your thesis. If you want help writing a body paragraph, use my paragraph generator. It will guide you through all the steps. Now the other 2 body paragraphs have the exact same format, so if you master this, you're in good shape. Finally, let's write a conclusion. You should, in your conclusion, restate your thesis using different language. You never want to use the exact same language that you've used elsewhere in the paper. You also want to review your main points. Remember that your main points are also called arguments, subpoints, claims, etc. And then finally, you want to end your paper with a sentence in which you comment on the importance of the topic. This is sometimes called a so what statement or a clincher. Now let's write a paper.
All right, gents, let's talk about the thesis statement. Let's say I'm writing a paper about John Steinbeck's novel Of Mice and Men. My teacher wants us to analyze a particular character. If I'm going to write a whole 5-paragraph essay on one character, I should probably pick one who has a big impact on the events of the novel. That eliminates people like the boss, Slim, Carlson, and Wit. They just aren't in the novel enough to warrant a whole paper. Now, I might be able to squeeze out a paper on Crooks, Curly, Candy, or Curly's wife, but I might be stretching things a bit. Probably wise to settle on George or Lenny because there's loads of information about either one of them. And since I personally prefer George and think he's more interesting, I choose him. All right, I've settled on my general topic, George, so I need to start brainstorming a thesis statement. And remember, when you brainstorm, don't eliminate ideas. Write them all down and then methodically pick out the best one. I need to figure out what argument I want to make about George. This argument will be the central argument of my paper, and it's called a thesis statement. When you're writing a thesis statement, keep in mind two things. The thesis must be arguable and provable. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. George Milton is a character in Of Mice and Men. Well, is this statement both arguable and provable? Well, it's provable. We know George is a character. Is it arguable? Ask yourself if any reasonable person would disagree with your statement. If the answer is no, your thesis is not arguable. And since nobody would disagree that George is a character, it's not arguable and therefore not useful as my thesis statement. Let's try another. But I don't want to completely erase this. I just want it out of my line of vision. So I'm just going to line it out, but keep it there in case so that I can see the progression as I'm writing. George Milton worked hard all his life so that he could move away from California. Well, this statement is arguable. We don't know about George's whole life, nor do we know that he wanted to move out of California. The big problem here is that the statement is not provable. The only proof you have for a statement made about literature is the literature itself. Now, we can speculate that George wanted to get out of California and out of ranching, maybe because we would if we were in his situation. But we cannot base our arguments on things we hope or wish were true. So, let's try again. And again, I'm just going to line through this one, but keep it on my paper. Here's try number 3. George Milton sacrificed a lot for his friends. Getting closer now, I can sense it, because this idea is text-based and more provocative than in the earlier tries. Ask yourself if this statement is arguable and provable. Yes, it's provable, but most reasonable people would not argue with this statement. Now, instead of scrapping the whole thing, let's see if we can tinker with it a bit. We can add that edge that will make it a strong statement. Here, I'm going to make the sentence complex. And I'm going to use what I had and make it a dependent clause. So, when George Milton sacrificed for his friend, now I'm going to need to add an arguable main clause. George, well, I already said George, he sacrificed a bit of himself. Well, I kind of like that. Let's see what I can do to make it better. Well, first things first, I know I can switch the subject of the clauses because I want the proper name to be in the main clause. So when he sacrificed for his friend, George Milton sacrificed a bit of himself. All right. Now I'm going to tinker with it just a little bit, and I'm going to change this to in sacrificing. Oops, in sacrificing his friend, George Milton sacrificed a bit of himself. And I think I need the word for in there. In sacrificing for his friend, George Milton sacrificed a bit of himself. I like it. One last note about the thesis statement. You cannot be a slave to the thesis statement. This is what I'm working with right now. But if I write the whole body of my paper and I discover that it doesn't quite prove this thesis that I settled on, does it make sense to scrap the whole body or to tinker with the thesis to make it fit? I'm not going to scrap 4 whole paragraphs. No way. I'm going to alter the thesis statement to fit what I have written. So it's a negotiation process between the thesis and the body. You need a thesis to guide you as you write, but you can't be a slave to it when you have written what's a pretty good body paragraph and you think you need to alter your thesis a bit. So after the outline to fit what you've written, alter the outline to fit what you've written. Now, on to the brainstorming.
If you've read the whole novel and taken good notes while you read, this part should be easy. Here's one way to do it. Begin by writing the topic in the middle of a sheet of paper. I'm writing about George, so I'll write simply George and sacrifice. Now I'll brainstorm every single example I can think of that's remotely related and write them all down. Remember, don't edit yourself when you're brainstorming. There are no bad ideas at this point. So I could talk about the escape from weed, meeting the boss, meeting Curly for the first time, how about making camp and eating beans, let's see, telling the story, telling Lenny the story, how about warning about Curly's wife, promising a puppy, um, defending Lenny to Slim. Let's see. How about giving instructions about the return to their campsite? How about telling Slim the river story when he told Lenny to jump in the river? How about killing Lenny? Awful scene. How about throwing away the mice? Uh, telling Lenny to fight back against Curly. Apologizing to Lenny for his anger. Let's see. How about the plan to buy the farm? Let's see. How about How about leaving Lenny in the bunkhouse when he went to town? Losing his weed money he would have made had he completed the job in weed. For that matter, losing his other jobs. Listening to Candy. About his dog. How about holding the work cards? Promise to Aunt Clara. How about comforting Lenny with the story at the end of the novel? About tricking the ranch hands. All right. You can see that I have a lot of examples, and if I spent some more time on it, I could probably come up with more. I will call this an embarrassment of riches. I now have the luxury of picking only the best examples to prove my points. When you can only come up with 4 or 5 examples, you're forced to use what you have, even if they aren't very strong. Now that I have all of these examples, what do I do with them? I organize. Now let's look at all these examples and see if I can discern connections among any of them. If I look at making camp and eating beans, throwing away the mice, holding the work cards, meeting Curly the first time, the escape from weed, and let's see, instructions for returning to camp. All right. I think all of these examples have in common George caring about Lenny physically. Now I'm on to something, and I can begin to formulate a topic sentence for a body paragraph. I could say something like, George cared about Lenny's physical well-being. Now, if I think about physical well-being as an organizing principle, it's easy to think of what a second point could be. I could talk about emotional well-being as well. If I continue with this idea of emotional well-being in a general sense, I can see, let's see, promising him a puppy, telling Lenny the story at camp, apologizing to Lenny for his anger, that also happened at the camp, comforting Lenny with the story before he shot him, warning him about Curly's wife. Okay. These could be the kernel of my second body paragraph. That George worried about Lenny's feelings and emotion. Now let's see if I can do something with the rest of these. Promising Aunt Clara that he'd look after Lenny. Listening to Candy about his dog. Killing Lenny. Shooting him. Tricking the ranch hands. Making a plan to buy the farm. Okay. These all have to do with planning for the future. And that could be made into my third body paragraph. So here I've got one body paragraph, here's a second, and here's a third. And you'll see that I have numerous examples to spare.
All right, gentlemen, we have our working thesis and we've done our brainstorming and we've loosely organized our brainstorming. So at this point, I have the bones of my outline. Now I'm going to polish it a bit. Your outline need not be 17 pages single-spaced, but it should be specific enough that you could write a draft without using the novel. Let's look at a bad example first. Bad examples, bad writing, often is bad because it has vague things on it like this. Instead of stating the actual argument, you'd write on your outline simply sub-argument number 1. Well, that's not very useful. Additionally, there would be kind of generalized examples on the outline. Well, food, shelter, and jobs could refer to almost every single novel ever written, so it's not specific enough to Of Mice and Men. Therefore, this is a useless outline. Instead, let's write just a bit more and see if we can develop something useful. My first group is about Lenny's physical well-being, but my paper is about George and how he sacrificed for Lenny. So I'm going to write, George sacrificed, George cared for Lenny's physical well-being. Okay, that part is true, but it's not very interesting. So I'm going to add a bit more to give it some teeth to make sure I'm addressing my thesis. Get rid of that period. And I'm going to add at the expense of his own. All right, I'm satisfied with that. Now, if you remember, in my rough group, I had 6 examples, what I called an embarrassment of riches. To prove a sub-argument, you need a minimum of 2. But since I have so many, I'm going to use 3, and I'm going to pick what I think are my best 3. So my first example was beans at camp. That's if you remember my bad outline, under A I had food. Well, that's fine, but beans at camp is a lot more specific, so much better. B, the escape from weed. And then C would be fighting back against Curly. Okay, now even though it's not a requirement, I like to have all the information I need right on my outline. So I like to include a quote. Find a quote that drives home the point you are making about one of your examples, and make sure you take note of the page on which you found it. So when I was paging through my book on page 10, I found a quote about the weed incident that I think will get across the idea that George's caretaking cost him a lot. And here it is. I'm going to add it to my outline as Q. You can't keep a job and you lose me every job I get. Notice that I'm typing it exactly as John Steinbeck had it. I'm not going to make it more grammatically correct. Just keep me shoving all over the country all the time. And that ain't the worst. Get in trouble. And here's the kicker. You do things and I got to get you out. Ooh, that's a good quote. Now, I added on my outline as Q, and I added underneath B because it goes along with B. This last sentence is really important because it addresses the stress that Lenny causes George. All right, let's go on to the second body paragraph on my outline. Again, because I have so many examples, I get to choose the best ones. Okay, I get to choose the 2 or 3 best ones. And I'm again going to find a quote. So Here's my second sub-argument. George worried about Lenny's feelings and emotions. I'm going to give myself a little space here. There we go. Oops. There we go. George worried about Lenny's feelings and emotions. Now I know I want to add that little extra bit that makes the sentence more provocative. So George worried about Lenny's feelings and emotions, although it cost him his own peace of mind. Pretty good. And the examples I'm going to use, George telling Lenny the story at camp. Hopefully I will be spelling George properly. Okay, that's example number 1. Number 2, warning Lenny about Curly's wife. Remember that? And then comforting Lenny before the end event. And I think you all know what I'm talking about. Now again, I want to add a quote, and I found a really good one, and it has to do with this last incident. And again, it's just my personal preference. I like, for some reason I can't get a Q on here. There we go. I'm going to add a Q and a quote, and it is, "No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I never been mad, and I ain't now. That's a thing I want you to know." That was page 102. Oh, I noticed I forgot to add my page number up here. Remember, that was page 10. Okay, things are looking pretty good here. Now my third paragraph. And I'm going to be always mindful that I'm addressing my thesis. So George continually had to think ahead in order to keep Lenny out of trouble. Okay, and once again, I'm incapable of spelling George. There we go. Okay, the examples I'm going to use. Let's see, making the plan, buy the house. That's a good one. Listening to Candy about his dog. If you recall that when he recalls what Candy had said about his dog when he has to make his big decision. And then planning to end Lenny's life. Okay, and the quote I found is related to the Candy incident. So here we go. "I ought to have shot that dog myself, George." Oh, look at that, I spelled it right. "I ought to have let no stranger shoot my dog." And that was from page 59. Oh, here's my outline. Let's take a look at the whole thing. I'll make it just a little bit smaller so you can see it all on one page. Maybe a little smaller. There we go. Got a straggler here. Okay, so that's my whole outline. Now, if you don't include the quotes, it's actually very, very short but specific. I include the quotes again because it's nice to have everything in front of me when I sit down to write the final draft, or excuse me, the rough draft. So that's outlining. And before I let you go, I gotta get rid of that T. There we go. All right, gentlemen, we have our outline and we've included the quotes. Now comes the rough draft. I'm going to use the inverted pyramid format for my introductory paragraph, which means I'm going to begin with a general statement. The importance Having a friend cannot be underestimated. Okay, now I'm going to include the tag. Remember that the tag is the title, the author, and the genre. And before I make any specific reference to the text, I need to have that tag in there. In John Steinbeck's novel of Mice and Men, George Milton recognizes the value of his friend Lenny Small, in spite of the trouble Lenny causes. Okay, so you can see right here, John Steinbeck's novel of Mice and Men. I have the title, the author, and the genre. And I started with a very general statement, and I'm getting a little bit more specific as I progress toward my thesis statement. Ultimately, George must sacrifice the only thing in his life that makes him different from the other itinerant workers. George, I should probably add something in there about his friendship with Lenny. His friendship with another person. There we go. George's compassion and humanity, though hidden by a gruff exterior, make him a good man. In sacrificing for his friend, George Milton sacrificed a bit of himself. Okay, not perfect, but I'm satisfied for the time being. Now let's go on to the first body paragraph. Let's take a look at our outline once again. There it is. So we've got our topic sentence, George cared for Lenny's physical well-being at the expense of his own. So I am just going to copy and paste that because I went to the trouble of writing that when I was doing my outline. So now I don't have to do that. So I'm going to make that the first sentence in my first body paragraph. George cares for Lenny's physical well-being at the expense of his own. And now I'm going to look at my examples up here, and I'm going to try and write a paragraph. And remember, when you're writing a paragraph, you want to cite the example and explain it. Cite the example and explain it, perhaps quote, and then cite the example and explain it. You've got to constantly explain how the examples you cite help prove that argument, and then ultimately help prove the thesis. So, got my topic sentence down, and so I'm just going to begin. As a smart, hard-working man without any physical or emotional limitations, George comments that he could certainly have found and kept jobs had Lenny not been his companion. All right, and obviously I'm not as careful with my typing as I will need to be on my final draft. In the novel, George constantly comments on how his life would be much easier without Lenny. Clearly, he felt the burden of caring for a man who could not care for himself. George had to care for Lenny's physical needs and worried often about where they would sleep. For example, now notice that I used some signal words here. For example, it's called a transitional word. You want to make sure that you have those very clear indications that you are going into an example. And then a transitional word will help you get from example to example and subsequently from paragraph to paragraph. So here I am. For example, George made sure Lenny had beans to eat the night prior to their arrival at the ranch. He also instructed Lenny to return to the spot by the river if he got more trouble. All right, now I probably want to explain that a little bit, but I'm kind of on a roll, so I'm going to keep going, okay? In the editing process, I'll make sure that I explain that. George also successfully executed his and Lenny's escape from weed, where the angry rancher intended to harm Lenny for what they believed was rape. Okay, I've been writing quite a bit, and I remember up here that I had a quote. Whoops, where'd it go? There it is. That my quote was associated with this example from weed. Okay, so I said George successfully executed his and Lenny's escape from weed where the angry ranchers intended to harm Lenny for what they believed was rape. Boy, I probably need a sentence in here to explain why this is a sacrifice for George. And I will do that, but I want to get this quote in first. So I'm going to write a lead-in sentence in which I provide the context of the quote. Remember that context means the place in the story from which the quote was chosen. All right, here goes. Over dinner, when Lenny complains that they do not have ketchup, George explodes with anger. There we go. All right, now I'm quoting dialogue, so I need to use normal quotation marks to indicate that I'm quoting from Steinbeck. But then I need to change Steinbeck's double quotation marks to single in order to indicate that I am quoting dialogue. So I'm just going to copy and paste this. Remember, I went to the trouble of copying it onto my outline. Well, now I can just copy and paste it right down here. There you go. Let's see if I can get that other guy turned around. Well, I'll figure that out later. You can't keep a job and you lose me every job I get. Just keep me shoving all over the country all the time. And that ain't the worst. You get in trouble, you do things, and I got to get you out. Okay, now I'm at the end of my quote. So I end the quote by using that single quote indicating that it's dialogue, and then a double quote indicating that I'm done with John Steinbeck's words. Now, we also need to, as conscientious students, we need to give credit to John Steinbeck for his words. This part is called the citation, and I'm going to add it right away. So remember that you've got the quote, the citation, or excuse me, we're going to add the parentheses, and then Steinbeck's last name, because this is my first quote, and then a space, and the page on which I found that quote, and that was on page 10, and parentheses, and then don't forget the period at the end, because you have got to end your quote. No one gets to end it except you. Notice that I got rid of the end punctuation here because it happened to be a period, and I end my own sentence right there. But I'm not done. I've got the quote in the citation, and I now need to interpret the quote. Don't simply restate the quote. Your reader can read the quote themselves, but the reader typically wants your explanation of the significance of the author's words. So here goes. George's frustration with Lenny boils over and he barks at him over something insignificant, the ketchup. Okay, now I'm going to use a transitional word or phrase to get to my next example. And I'm going to use later in the story, George instructs Lenny to fight back. Curly is repeatedly punching him. I need to explain this sentence because it doesn't. When I look right at it right now, look like it's explained well enough. Since George had previously warned Lenny not to engage with Curly, he has to contradict himself so that Lenny will not get seriously injured. Lenny does not even have the sense to defend himself when he is attacked. Remember that I need to conclude every body paragraph. I use my body paragraph conclusions to wrap up that paragraph and to remind the reader about my thesis. So I need to get across the idea of sacrifice. And I'll give it a shot right now. The burden for Lenny's well-being falls on George, who has to sacrifice his own peace because of the stress Lenny causes. Okay, so I've got a draft of my first body paragraph here. It's going to need some editing, but I've got a pretty good start here. Now the next two body paragraphs will be executed the same way. And I would just kind of laboriously go through that process. But right now, let's move on to the conclusion. Remember that I want to restate my thesis with fresh words and review my main points. Then I'll need that so what statement at the end. George Milton was far from perfect. Nevertheless, he gave his life for a friend as he cared for him physically and emotionally. Okay, that looks like a pretty decent restatement of my thesis. John Steinbeck made George's sacrifice of Lenny's life be a sacrifice in George's life as well. He lost much by caring for Lenny, but he also gained immeasurably because he was not alone in the world. I'm liking where this is going. Clearly, Steinbeck believed that a single ethical man, though he sacrifices much, benefits from his own virtue. Although George's life would never be easy, the reader can be the dignity of a man who preserves and promotes the dignity of another human being through its simple kindness. All right. Well, there's my draft. On to the next step, revision and editing. The best thing to do once you've written your draft is to ignore it for a day or two. When you come back to it, you will have a clear, unemotional head and will be able to edit more critically. Revision is about moving things around, adding and subtracting words, sentences, and paragraphs. Editing is about cleaning up the errors in punctuation, usage, syntax. You will want to print out your paper and edit by hand so that you can see the evolution of your work. Sometimes you want to go back to something you had written earlier. When you edit on the computer, you cannot see that evolution because your work disappears as soon as you delete it. So I have done the editing by hand, and now I'm going to show you the changes that I've made on the screen here. First of all, I'm going to start with something better as a title than rough draft. George's self-sacrifice in of mice and men. Oops, men. And that's the title. I'll make sure that I have that in italics. Okay, I like a lot of my introduction, but I think there are some things that need to be changed. So the importance of having a friend cannot be underestimated, but friendships are costly. Okay, John Steinbeck's novel of Mice and Men, George Milton recognizes the value of his friend Lenny Small in spite of the trouble Lenny causes. Okay, I'm not sure I like in spite of the trouble Lenny causes. So I'm going to change that into in spite of the hardship George suffers when capable of spelling George. George suffers as a result of their George Milton recognizes the value of his friend Lenny Small in spite of the hardship George suffers as a result of their union. I like that better. All right, ultimately George will sacrifice the only thing in his life that makes him different from, I'm going to say that differentiates him from the other itinerant workers. And I'm going to add a little more information here. In Northern California in the 1930s. There we go. His friendship with another person. Okay, and leading down into my thesis statement, I'm pretty happy with that. So now let's go on to this first body paragraph. George cared for Lenny's physical well-being at the expense of his own. All right, and then I think, as a smart, hardworking man without any physical or emotional limitations, George comments that he could have certainly found and kept jobs had Lenny not been his companion. I think this next sentence in the novel, George constantly comments on how his life would be much easier without Lenny. I think I've already essentially said that right up here. So I'm just going to get rid of that. Okay, George, clearly he felt the burden of caring for a man who could not care for himself. George had to care for Lenny's physical needs and worried often about where they would sleep or eat. All right, and I don't think I need this sentence either. That might just be extra. So I'm going to go right into my example. For example, George made sure Lenny had beans to eat the night prior to their arrival at the ranch. I think I need to add a little bit more information there. For example, George carried food, several cans of beans in his bindle, and made sure Lenny had enough to eat the night prior to their arrival at the ranch. Now, I think I need to explain this sentence keeping in mind my thesis and my sub-argument at all times. Lenny had proven with the work cards that he couldn't, or that his memory was unreliable. Thus, George knows he must procure and carry food. I think I like that. Let's take a look at it one more time. George carried several cans of beans in his bindle and made sure Lenny had enough to eat the night prior to their arrival at the ranch. Lenny had proven with the work cards that his memory was unreliable. Thus, George knows he must procure and carry the food. All right, he also instructed Lenny, this should be instructs, I'll use the literary present tense, return to the spot by the river if he got into more trouble. I don't think I need this sentence at all. That looks like a slightly different example, so I'm going to delete it. All right. Additionally, I need a transitional word in here, so I'm going to add additionally. George, and now I can get rid of that also. George successfully executed, let's say, make that execute, his and Lenny's escape from Weed, where the angry ranchers intended to harm Lenny for what they believed was rape. I'm going to need some explanation for this, like I needed for the previous example. Since the mob intended to lynch Lenny, George, as his friend, George's life was likely danger as well. Okay. Now, over dinner, let's see what we have here. Over dinner, when Lenny complains that they do not have ketchup, George explodes with anger. I can't keep a job and you lose me every job I get. Just keep me shoving all over the country all the time. And that ain't the worst. You get in trouble, you do things, and I got to get you out. Steinbeck, page 10. Okay, and I kind of like what I did there. I have a decent, I've set the context by saying over dinner when Lenny complains. I know exactly where that is in the novel. I've got my quote. I've cited it properly. And then I do like the explanation of the quote that I've provided. George's frustration with Lenny boils over and he barks at him over something insignificant, the ketchup. Later in the story, and here's another transition, George instructs Lenny to fight back when Curly is repeatedly punching him. Since George had previously warned Lenny not to engage with Curly, he has to contradict himself so that Lenny will not get seriously injured. Lenny does not even have the sense to defend himself when he is attacked. The burden for Lenny's well-being falls on George, sacrifices his own peace because of the stress Lenny causes him. All right, I'm pretty satisfied with that. Let's take a look at the conclusion. All right, George Milton was far from perfect. Nevertheless, he gave, he gave his life. He gave up his life. Not quite accurate. Let's change life to his comfort and happiness. George Milton, he gave up his comfort and happiness for a friend as he cared for him physically and emotionally. John Steinbeck made George's sacrifice of Lenny's life be a sacrifice in George's life as well. He lost much by caring for Lenny. He gained immeasurably because he was not alone in the world. When he makes a fateful decision at the end, George ensures that his own life will be lonely. Clearly, Steinbeck believed that a single ethical man, though he sacrifices much, benefits from his own virtue. Easy, the dignity. Okay, I am pretty satisfied with what I have, and I would probably let it sit for another day and then go back and edit it again.